Hello, my name is Daniel, and I never thought the moment that broke me would come dressed in a tuxedo, under soft lights, with champagne in everyone's hands. At my own brother's wedding, he stood up smiling and turned me into the joke of the night. They laughed. Strangers laughed. Family laughed. Even my father laughed, then covered his mouth like it was something to be proud of. I sat there, frozen, realizing this wasn't just one cruel speech. It was a lifetime of being erased, finally said out loud. And just when I thought that silence was all I deserved, the bride stood up, reached for the microphone, and everything I thought I knew about my place in that family began to fall apart. Have you ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, only to discover it was destroying you? I arrived before most of the guests. That wasn't unusual. It never was. I'd gotten used to being early, to stepping into rooms before the music started and the chairs were warm. It gave me time to adjust, to blend in. The ballroom was already dressed for celebration. White linens, gold-trimmed glasses, strings of lights coiled around beams, like someone had tried too hard to make the place feel magical. I watched a young woman on staff adjust a centerpiece, then another move a speaker stand to the corner near the dance floor. No one greeted me. No one waved. Not even the groom, my brother, when he passed by talking with the photographer. He didn't look at me, didn't slow down, like I wasn't even there. I took a breath and walked in further, past a group of older guests who barely glanced up. I nodded politely. They nodded back with that half smile you give someone you think you've seen at the DMV once. A clipboard girl approached me, eyes scanning a list. "You're Jared, right?" "Yes." "Could you check the light on that mic stand near the cake? We think it's off." She said it like she knew I'd say yes, and I did. I walked across the room without hesitation, checked the cable, pressed a button, watched the green light flicker on. Nobody said thank you. Of course they didn't. Fixing things quietly had always been my job. I couldn't count how many Christmas mornings I spent under the sink or replacing batteries in someone else's toy. When something broke, I was called. Not because they trusted me, but because I wouldn't make it a thing. I didn't make things a thing. That's what made me useful. Back near the bar, I saw my cousin talking to my uncle. They didn't see me. Or maybe they did. Either way, they didn't stop. Just a glance in my direction, then back to their laughter. I moved toward the seating chart. A woman in a lavender dress pointed it out with a tap of her acrylic nail. "Looks like you're table 17. That's back near the patio doors." I followed the sign. The table was tucked near the back, right next to where staff kept exiting with trays. It wasn't hidden, but it wasn't meant to be seen either. The napkin at my place was folded unevenly. It didn't matter. None of it ever did. A waiter brushed past me carrying a bucket of ice. Another paused, thinking I might be part of the staff. I didn't correct him. I stood there a while before sitting. From my seat, I could see my family laughing near the head table. My father leaned back, booming his voice as he teased one of the groomsmen. My mother smiled but didn't look my way. Not once. Then came the small moment that said everything. My aunt, who barely made eye contact, leaned in and whispered, "Hey, Jared, would you mind running out to the car real quick? I think I left my phone in the front seat." She handed me the keys without waiting for a reply. "Sure," I said, just like always. As I stepped out into the cooler evening air, I looked back through the window. Inside, everyone was finding their seats, glasses clinking already. No one noticed I was gone. That didn't surprise me. I opened her car, found the phone, locked it again. On my way back in, I caught my reflection in the glass. I looked like a guest, but I didn't feel like one. Back inside, I gave her the phone. She smiled and turned away mid-sentence. I sat back down at table 17, alone. This was the role. The quiet one. The runner. The fixer. The one who blended into corners and didn't ask questions. And for a long time, I thought that keeping quiet was how you kept peace. But I didn't know yet that staying quiet that night would cost me more than speaking ever could. I stepped back into the ballroom with my hands empty and my shoulders slightly tighter than before. The doors closed behind me with a soft thud that no one noticed. Inside, the room had shifted while I was gone. Not dramatically. Just enough to remind me how quickly things move when you're not part of the center. Every table was full now. Plates clinked. Glasses were lifted. Conversations overlapped in that comfortable, familiar hum that says everyone has settled in. I paused near the entrance for a moment, scanning faces, waiting for someone to catch my eye. No one did. It was strange how invisible you could feel in a room filled with people who had known you your whole life. I walked slowly toward the back, careful not to interrupt anyone, the way you do when you already know you're not expected to belong. As I passed the seating chart again, I stopped, not because I needed to check it. I already knew where my place was. I stopped because a part of me still wanted to believe there had been a mistake, that maybe someone had switched cards at the last minute, that maybe I had misread it earlier. I hadn't. My name sat exactly where it had before, far from the family tables, far from the laughter. Close enough to hear it, though. Close enough to know what I was missing. A couple standing beside me glanced over, then back at the list. The woman leaned toward her partner and whispered something I couldn't hear. They looked at me again, politely confused, as if trying to place me in the story of the night. I gave them a small nod and moved on. I sat down. The photographer's voice cut through the room a few minutes later. He was cheerful, efficient, the kind of man who knew how to move people where he needed them without sounding bossy. All right, family first. Let's get the parents up here. Siblings, too. Chairs scraped. People stood. My brother laughed as someone adjusted his jacket. My father straightened his tie. My mother smoothed her hair. No one looked in my direction. I waited. Not because I thought they would call my name, but because some habits die hard. I stayed seated as the photographer shifted bodies, pulled people closer, tilted chins, counted down. The flash went off. That was it. I felt it then, sharp and unmistakable. Not confusion, not disappointment, clarity. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been left out. A man at the neighboring table leaned over, nodding toward me with a friendly smile. "Sharp suit," he said. "Looks like you didn't get the memo on matching colors, though." He chuckled, not unkindly. Someone else laughed with him. I smiled because that's what you do when a joke lands just off center but still expects a reaction. "Guess I missed that email," I said lightly. They turned back to their conversation without another thought. I reached for my glass and took a small sip. Nearby, my brother's voice carried across the room as he told a story. People leaned in. They always did. He had a way of making every moment feel bigger than it was. I tried to join in a conversation at my table, offered a comment about the venue, the food, anything neutral. The response came a beat too late, just long enough to feel. Someone nodded. Someone else picked up a different thread. The moment passed without resistance. That half second said more than words ever could. It wasn't one thing. It was all of it together. The chair at the edge, the missing photo, the easy jokes, the pauses where my presence failed to register. I wasn't hurt by a single moment. I was worn down by the pattern. How long had I been accepting this? The question settled in quietly, heavier than I expected. A voice at the front of the room broke through my thoughts. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, testing the sound. The hum of conversation softened. "All right, everyone," he said, smiling wide. "If I could have your attention, we'll be starting speeches in just a moment." My brother stood up, relaxed, confident, adjusting his jacket as if this were his natural place. The room shifted toward him without effort. I stayed seated. Something tightened in my chest. Not panic exactly, more like instinct. The kind that warns you before a storm you can't yet see. When my brother picked up the microphone, I told myself it would only be a joke. I shifted in my chair as the room settled into a hush that felt rehearsed. Forks were set down. Someone coughed. A glass chimed softly near the front. All eyes turned toward my brother as he stepped forward, comfortable in the spotlight, the way some people always are. He held the microphone loosely, like it was an extension of his hand. He smiled and waited just long enough for the room to lean in. "I won't keep this long," he said. "I know everyone's ready to eat." A ripple of chuckles moved through the tables. I sat a little straighter, unsure why my shoulders had tightened. I told myself this was routine. Weddings came with speeches. Speeches came with jokes. It would pass. He started with easy stories, childhood memories, the kind that made people nod and laugh because they sounded harmless on the surface. He talked about our parents, about growing up, about how family always finds a way to show up for each other. I watched faces soften. I watched people relax. Then he said my name. It landed cleanly in the air, clear enough that there was no pretending I hadn't heard it. My first reaction was surprise, not fear, not anger, just a small, sharp awareness that something had shifted. He smiled again. "You all know my brother," he said, turning slightly so more of the room could see me. "He's always been, well, different." A few people laughed, uncertain but willing. "He's the kind of guy who needs a little extra help," my brother continued. "Never really found his footing. Never quite earned the respect the rest of us worked for." The words came smoothly, practiced. They didn't rush. They didn't stumble. Laughter grew louder, more confident. My chest tightened. I felt heat rise to my face, then drain away just as quickly. I tried to read the room, to find a signal that this was going somewhere safer. It didn't. "He's had plenty of chances," my brother said, "but some people just don't know how to make something of themselves, right?" That's when the sound hit me. Not one laugh. Dozens. A wave of it. Chairs shifting. Hands tapping tables. I couldn't move. My body locked in place as if someone had reached inside and turned a dial. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't even sad. I was suspended somewhere between disbelief and instinct, trying to understand how a room full of people could turn me into a punchline without hesitation. Then my father's voice cut in. "He's always been a disappointment," he said casually, like he was commenting on the weather. "But we love him anyway." More laughter. I looked at him. He didn't look back. He covered his mouth with his hand, not to hide his words, but to hide the smile that followed. It was small, familiar, the kind I'd seen my whole life when he thought he'd said something clever. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't a slip. It wasn't a bad joke that went too far. It had been allowed, maybe even encouraged. I stayed seated. My hands rested on my knees, heavy and useless. I didn't laugh because I couldn't. I didn't speak because nothing would come out. I didn't leave because my legs wouldn't respond. People glanced at me, some amused, some uncomfortable. No one stood up. No one interrupted. A few eyes slid away quickly, as if avoiding a mess they didn't want to clean. The room felt enormous and empty at the same time. I searched faces for something solid, a hint of objection, a sign that someone saw what was happening and found it wrong. What I found instead was indifference. The applause came when my brother finished. It was polite, then enthusiastic. The kind you give when you want to signal approval without thinking too hard about why. I clapped too. Once, twice, not because I wanted to, but because my hands knew the motion even when my mind had gone quiet. As the noise filled the room again, a thought began to repeat itself, slow and relentless. Maybe this is who I am. It wasn't loud. It didn't shout. It settled in gently, like something that had been waiting for the right moment to take shape. Years of staying quiet pressed in at once. Every time I'd told myself it wasn't worth the argument. Every time I'd chosen peace over truth. Every time I'd laughed along just enough to keep things smooth. The speech ended. The microphone was set down. Glasses lifted again. I stayed where I was, smaller than I'd ever felt, watching the celebration move on without me. That was the moment I realized staying silent wasn't protecting me anymore. I didn't stand when everyone else did. I didn't clap. I didn't even blink for a long moment. Instead, I sat motionless while the room surged back to life around me. Silverware scraped against plates again. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose from the far tables like nothing had just happened. Like I hadn't just been publicly stripped of my dignity. People leaned in to resume conversations as if a 5-minute character assassination hadn't taken place. The volume of the room returned quickly, unnaturally so, like a radio turned up to drown out something uncomfortable. I scanned the crowd, half expecting someone to glance my way with concern or regret. But no one did. I sat inside the same tuxedo I'd worn since 3 o'clock. Same cufflinks. Same uncomfortable shoes. But I didn't feel like a person in the room anymore. I felt like part of the decor, something old, dusty, wedged in a corner because it couldn't be thrown out yet. Behind me, 2 men chuckled. One of them said something like, "He's probably used to it by now." And it wasn't said cruelly, just casually, like it was a fact, a weather report. He's used to it. 4 words. 4 words heavier than my brother's entire speech. I wasn't shocked by what was said. I was stunned by how true everyone assumed it was. Used to it. Like this was normal. Like I'd been handed the role of family scapegoat so long ago, no one even remembered the casting. And the worst part? They were right, at least partially. I had helped build this, brick by brick, year after year. I let things slide. I let jokes go. I told myself it wasn't worth it. I played along with the myth of me being harmless, invisible, a little slow to catch on. Quiet meant safe, I thought. Now quiet just meant forgotten. I looked at the microphone still resting on the small stand near the head table. My brother had returned to his seat, toasting his new wife. Guests leaned in, smiling at the couple, whispering compliments. The moment was perfect. On the surface. I could have walked up there. I could have interrupted it all, taken the mic, and told them what it felt like to be erased. But I didn't move, because I saw the trap. If I stood up, They'd say I ruined the evening, that I made it all about me, that I couldn't take a joke. I'd be labeled as bitter, unstable, selfish. But if I stayed silent again, they'd take that as proof that what was said was true, that I really was spineless, forgettable, the guy who always needed help. It was a lose-lose game, one I'd been playing for decades without realizing it, until now. And then I saw her, the bride. She sat straight, hands folded in her lap, expression unreadable. She hadn't laughed. She hadn't clapped. She hadn't even turned her head to join in the celebration. Her stillness was the first genuine thing I'd seen all night. I watched her carefully. Not once did she reach for her champagne glass. Not once did she look at my brother. She was listening, still, to the echoes of what had just been said, and to what hadn't. A part of me hesitated to believe it. She was new to this family, still adjusting to the layers of polite cruelty that passed for bonding. She didn't know the full history, the years of kidding that left real bruises. But then her eyes met mine. Not pity, not confusion, recognition. And just like that, I realized she had heard enough. Not just tonight. She'd seen it in the way my father smirked when my name was brought up. She'd noticed how no one looked toward me when group photos were taken. She heard the weight behind their words, the glee dressed as jest. And I knew. She believed me. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. I didn't stand. I didn't storm out. I didn't reach for the mic. Not because I was scared, because I wasn't going to waste this moment. There's a kind of silence that's born of surrender, and there's another that's forged from control. For the first time in my life, I understood the difference. This wasn't retreat. This was restraint. If I'd spoken now, it would have been reaction. Raw, messy, dismissed. But something was shifting. I saw it in the way the bride leaned forward just slightly, her eyes never leaving the front of the room. She was waiting, not for food, not for the next toast, for the right moment. And for once, I wasn't the only one who noticed something wrong. The air in the room changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that I felt it in my chest. A pressure, a pause, like the moment before lightning cracks across the sky. Everyone else kept smiling, kept chewing, kept talking, but I sat still, waiting. That's when she stood up and reached for the microphone. She didn't hesitate. Alicia reached the microphone with the same ease you'd expect from someone about to offer a polite thank you. But when she turned to face the room, there was nothing polite in her posture. She stood straight, not rigid, but grounded, composed in a way that made people stop mid-sentence. A few heads turned, then a few more. Chairs shifted, clinking forks were set down. Laughter didn't trail off, it just stopped. She didn't glance at me. She didn't search for approval. Her gaze swept across the tables slowly, eyes settling briefly on faces. Her new in-laws, old college friends, and people who had clapped a little too loudly for a joke that had cut too deep. "Before we move on," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I need to say something." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. A few chuckles bubbled near the back, that awkward reflex when someone thinks it might all be part of the show. But she didn't smile. She didn't pause to let anyone catch up. "This isn't a joke," she continued, "and if anyone thinks it is, I want you to listen carefully." That was the moment the temperature shifted. The laughter dissolved completely. I saw a man in a gray suit lower his champagne glass mid-sip. A cousin tilted her head, suddenly alert. Alicia's words cut through the air like the opposite of a toast. I've been around this family long enough now to notice patterns, subtle ones. The way certain people are asked to speak and others are asked to carry boxes. The way kindness is mistaken for weakness. And how silence gets interpreted as agreement. She wasn't angry. That's what made it powerful. She didn't perform outrage. She simply described the behavior, named it, laid it bare like facts on a table. And tonight, she added, I heard a lot of laughter after a speech that wasn't funny. No one moved. My brother sat frozen, one hand still resting on the back of his chair like he hadn't yet decided whether to get up or stay seated. My father's expression was unreadable. His gaze drifted to his lap. The smirk was gone. Alicia looked out at the crowd again. This man, she gestured toward me now, has been called many things tonight, but I've watched how he shows up early, how he handles things no one else notices, how he quietly fixes what others break, and how often that's rewarded with silence. A shuffle, a cough, someone shifted in their chair. Some of you have known him longer than I have, but maybe that's the problem. Sometimes familiarity makes us blind to damage we've helped create. Phones were already up. I didn't know who started recording first, but the soft clicks of camera apps felt louder than applause ever could. I sat still, unsure what to do with my hands. She hadn't asked me to speak, hadn't told anyone to apologize. She'd simply, finally, said the thing no one else ever had. The truth. And no one could walk that back. No one interrupted her. Not my mother. Not the wedding coordinator nervously eyeing the cake schedule. Not even the DJ who'd been reaching for his playlist, now frozen mid-move. When Alicia lowered the mic, she didn't look for applause. She didn't wait to see how people reacted. She turned and walked back to the head table, back to her seat, like she hadn't just redefined the entire power structure in the room. And the silence that followed, it wasn't awkward. It was earned. I stood slowly. I didn't walk to the microphone. I didn't say a word. I didn't even glance at my brother. I just pushed in my chair. Somewhere near the dessert table, someone whispered, "Thank you for saying it." Not to me, but about me. That was enough. I walked toward the exit. Not quickly. Not like I was storming out. Just walking like a man who had somewhere else to be now. Like someone who finally realized he didn't owe this room anything. Outside, the night air felt different, cleaner somehow. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't look back through the window. For the first time in my life, I didn't need to explain who I was, because the truth had already been heard.